I swear that day, I truly thought I was going to die. It wasn't a fleeting thought, one of those that pass quickly when you're scared. It was a cold, heavy certainty, the kind that sinks into your chest and feels like it's shackled to the ground. The war had already put me in bad situations, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced that morning. Nothing at all. The attack began before sunrise. Fog covered everything. The earth smelled of burnt oil, and the air had that metallic taste that only appears when something very bad is about to happen. I remember the first bang. It wasn't just a noise. It was as if someone had ripped the ground from under my feet. In seconds, what was an organized formation turned into chaos. Screams, flying earth, explosion light blinding my eyes. I just tried to react, but it was as if the world was collapsing too fast for me to keep up. When I managed to lift my head, half my platoon was no longer there. The other half was lost in the smoke, running in different directions, trying to survive by instinct. I searched for my weapon, but only found its twisted, burnt casing. My canteen was gone. My map turned to ashes. All that remained was the impulse to keep breathing, even without knowing where to go. That's when the second explosion came. It threw me far away, as if I were just a piece of cloth. I felt a hot tear in my leg, another in my arm, and the sound disappeared. Everything became muffled, as if I had gone underwater. That's when I understood that I was alone, without a weapon, without a team, without anything. I was just a wounded soldier in a smoke-filled clearing, and the enemy was close, very close. I tried to crawl to a piece of tree trunk to hide, but each movement seemed to drain a little more of my strength. The taste of blood filled my mouth. My uniform was wet and hot, and it was at that point, exactly at that point, that I saw the scene that froze my entire body. The enemy tank advancing toward me. It emerged slowly, but surely, like a huge beast that knows it dominates the terrain. The tracks crushed everything, the earth vibrated, and the cannon seemed to look directly at me. I had no way to escape. I had no weapon to fight back. I had no one to cover me. I was just an easy target, lying on the ground, bleeding. And in that instant, something happened inside me. I don't know if it was fear or a last desperate attempt to stay alive, but I made a decision that I still can't believe. I had the courage to make. I faced the tank. Me, wounded, unarmed, alone, looking at a machine made to kill. But what happened next? No one would ever believe it without hearing my voice, because the decision that the driver of that tank made, which I saw with my own eyes, saved us both. And that's what I'm going to tell you now. Would you have the courage to follow me to the end of this story? Before continuing, go ahead and like and subscribe, because that really helps those who produce this kind of intense narrative here. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching all this from? I want to know how far this story is going. Let's continue, because what comes next is even more intense. The first thing I remember after the explosion was the taste of earth entering my mouth. I didn't feel pain immediately, just that strange numbness that deceives you, as if the body was still trying to understand what had happened. I slowly opened my eyes, and everything was shadow, smoke, and pieces of burning tree. The air was heavy, difficult to breathe. The feeling was like waking up in the middle of a nightmare from which there was no escape. The front line had become a labyrinth of holes and debris. My platoon, which minutes before had been advancing steadily, had been swallowed up by the enemy attack. The artillery hit so accurately, it seemed as if someone had marked our every step on their map. When I tried to get up, my knee buckled weakly, and I fell again. My weapon, which should have been strapped to my chest, was gone. I searched the ground, groping like a blind man, but only found its metal body, broken in half, covered in soot. It was useless. If I were attacked there, what would my defense be? A stone. My own fingers. The smoke grew thicker and thicker, and all I could hear was the crackling of burning wood, the distant groan of someone wounded, and nothing else. No commands, no friendly voices, no sign that I wasn't completely alone. The radio he carried was destroyed. Its frame was smoking. My canteen was gone. My backpack was torn and empty, as if it had been ripped off and turned inside out by the impact itself. The only thing I still had with me was my helmet, bent, crumpled, but still attached to my head. I wanted to believe that someone from my platoon was still standing, hiding, looking for me. But every passing second only proved otherwise. That place was a death trap. Those who hadn't died in the initial explosion had been forced to retreat, or were as lost as I was. And I was lying in the middle of it all, blood running down my leg and my vision failing. I tried to crawl because standing still was the same as signing my death warrant. The ground was damp, mixed with something I knew wasn't just mud. Every time I pulled my body, my shoulder burned as if someone had stuck a hot iron in it. When I touched the injured area, my hand turned red. The cut was deep, and the chance of infection there, in that cold and dirty environment, was enormous. But the fear of dying at that very moment was still greater than the fear of what would come next. The distant sound of engines began to grow louder. At first, I thought it was my imagination, because the noise was muffled, mixed with the echo of artillery, but gradually it became impossible to ignore. They were heavy, slow, steady engines, the kind of sound that makes the ground vibrate before you can see anything. And it was at that point that reality hit hard. A tank was coming towards me. I hid behind a fallen tree, but it barely covered me. The trunk was cracked, destroyed, and I could see the glint of the tracks approaching through the smoke. Each step of that machine made my chest heave inside. It was as if the earth was warning, "He's coming for you." I desperately searched for something to use as a weapon, a broken bayonet, a piece of iron, anything, but I only found burnt branches, splinters of wood, and a blown-up grenade casing. Nothing that could even scratch it. My entire life now depended on remaining still, hidden, quiet. But how could I do that while bleeding, weak, and dizzy? The tank moved slowly but surely. It wasn't looking for anyone in particular. It was clearing the area, crushing everything in its path. The tracks shredded pieces of tree, rocks, bodies. The smell of burnt oil grew stronger. The roar of the engine filled my ears. I tried to crawl to the side, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt a snap in my ribs when I tried to turn. The world spun for a second, and then I heard something that shattered me inside. The cannon spinning. The metallic sound, slow and heavy, was pointed directly at me. I knew it without even needing to see it. The size of the shadow that formed on the ground gave it away. I was in the center of the target. My heart began to beat strangely, as if it wanted to burst out of my throat. There was no more war noise around me. There was no wind, no tremor, only that mechanical sound aligning with my death. And, however absurd it may seem, at that moment, I didn't think about medals, about missions, about patriotism. I thought about my mother. I thought about the smell of coffee from her kitchen. I thought about the silence of my street. I thought I would never go home again. I was about to close my eyes when I noticed something unexpected. A small detail, but one that cut through the terror for a second. The tank slowed down. It didn't stop. It just slowed down. And it was there, in that inexplicable moment, that my life took a turn that no soldier would believe without hearing it from me. Because what that pilot did, and what I did afterward, changed not only my destiny, but his as well. Just remembering it makes my body react as if I were lying in that cold mud again. When the tank slowed down, for a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I was injured, dizzy, covered in mud and blood. Maybe I was hallucinating. But no, the sound changed. It was no longer that firm, confident advance of a machine that cuts through everything without thinking. It was a lower, dragging rumble, as if the driver had hesitated. It was at that exact moment that I realized how bad I was. Until then, fear had pushed me forward, as if my body were functioning on autopilot. But when the danger was suspended for a few seconds, the pain took over. My shoulder throbbed like a heart out of place. My leg was hot and cold at the same time, a mixture I only understood. Later, I was losing blood too fast. My face was covered in dirt mixed with dried blood, and my vision was blurred, with black spots appearing and disappearing with each blink. I tried to brace myself with my hand on the ground to lift myself at least a little, but my arm gave way instantly. I fell to the side, and a groan escaped involuntarily. That was a mistake. The sound though faint, echoed in the silent clearing. At that same instant, the tank's tracks stopped. That absolute silence was worse than any gunshot. The engine continued running, roaring, but the vehicle remained motionless, like a predator that had heard the movement of its prey. I knew I was trapped, wounded, unarmed, with no way to escape, and worst of all, exposed. The fallen tree I used as shelter now looked like a useless log, incapable of hiding even a rabbit, much less a grown soldier trying to survive. The tank hatch opened with a slow, dragging, metallic creak, as if it hadn't been used for decades. The sound cut through the air. I stood motionless, not because I wanted to, but because my body simply had no more strength. The pain was so intense that I could only breathe in small gasps. A head appeared. A German helmet, black, covered in dust and scratches. The pilot looked around, surveying the area, and then looked down. He looked where I was. I felt his gaze pierce me even from a distance. I could swear that in that instant, for just a second, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a fallen man, a man who clearly had no way to attack, no way to run, no way to pose any threat. It was impossible for me to understand what was going through his mind, but I noticed the pause, a real pause, a human pause, a pause that could cost him his life if someone superior found out. But there, in that destroyed terrain, amidst the smoke and mud, we were just two survivors clinging to the edge of our own fate. He said something, but I didn't understand. My hearing was still impaired. I only heard it as if it were distant, muffled, but the tone wasn't aggressive. It was shorter, more restrained, almost doubtful. I tried to speak too, but my voice came out as a whisper. My throat burned. My mouth was dry as sand. The only sound I could manage was a hoarse groan, and perhaps it was that detail, that weak, powerless sound, that made him leave the hatch completely. First came his hands, then his shoulders, and finally he jumped out of the tank, descending slowly, carefully, without haste. He didn't point a weapon immediately. That made me even more nervous. It was as if he were trying to understand what kind of choice he was about to make. I felt a strong dizziness. The world began to spin in a strange way, as if I had entered a slow and inevitable rotation. The sound of the tank's engine grew more distant. The lights seemed to gradually fade. My body began to feel heavy, as if I were sinking into quicksand. I tried to keep my eyes open, but I failed miserably. My head fell to the side, and everything went dark for a few seconds. When I returned, I was still on the ground. I didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds, maybe minutes. The pilot was a few steps closer. He was watching me like someone trying to decide between acting with his head or acting with his heart. The gun was slung over his shoulder, but not in a firing position. He was breathing heavily, as if he too were under pressure. I thought, this is it. He's going to finish the job. War taught us all to be practical, and killing a wounded enemy was, for many, the logical choice. Quick, sure, but he didn't do that. He stood there, motionless, studying my condition. I think he realized I was on the verge of collapse. Any sudden movement could be my last. The wind blew weakly, carrying the smell of gunpowder and hot metal. The smoke danced between us, as if separating two different worlds, his and mine. I tried to raise my hand, perhaps instinctively, perhaps as a silent plea, but it barely lifted a few inches before falling again. That's when he took the first step towards me. I felt my heart race. I didn't know if that meant help or execution. At that moment, either would have made sense. He approached closer, slowly, observing everything around him, alert to any threat, but there was something in his gaze that didn't fit the battlefield. It was a tired look, the look of someone who had already seen too many deaths to think that one more would make any difference. And then, without warning, my body gave way. The pain spread so forcefully through my chest that I lost my breath. My vision went black for the second time. Before I passed out, the last thing I saw were his boots standing less than a meter from me. And at that moment, when everything went dark again, I could only think of one thing. If I woke up, and I wasn't sure if that would happen, my life would never be the same again, because an enemy had gotten out of a tank and approached me, and I still didn't know why. When I woke up again, the sky was clearer. The smoke still obscured part of my vision, but I could better distinguish the outline of the surrounding trees. The first sensation was the cold cutting through my skin. The second was pain, a pain so intense it felt like it was pulsing with my heart. But the third sensation, that was the strangest. I was no longer in the same place. I wasn't lying in the mud like before. I was half leaning against a tree trunk, my back straight. The pressure on my shoulder had lessened, and when I looked down, I saw a makeshift cloth tied around my neck, stopping some of the bleeding. It wasn't mine. I didn't have any clean fabric like that. Someone had done it for me. That's when I saw him again. The pilot was sitting a few steps away, still wearing his helmet, but with his weapon resting on the ground, out of his reach. He had his back to me, looking at the horizon, like someone watching or thinking too much. His posture wasn't one of attack. It was one of caution, perhaps of doubt, perhaps of fear. I tried to speak, but only a weak groan escaped. He turned his head immediately. When our eyes met, I saw something I didn't expect to find in an enemy soldier. Hesitation. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't arrogance. It was humanity. He stood up slowly and came towards me, taking firm but not aggressive steps. Every move he made seemed calculated. He knew I could die at any moment, and he also knew that if he wanted to finish me off, he would have done it sooner. But he didn't. Instead, he crouched down next to me, pointing to the cloth on my shoulder, as if to show me that he was the one who put it there. I took a deep breath, trying to understand. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, my hands trembled. But one thing was clear. He was keeping me alive. Even though he was my enemy, even though he was in a war that taught the opposite, he chose not to abandon me in the mud. He spoke again in German. This time, I could hear better, but I still didn't understand the words. It was a short, firm sentence, spoken in a tired voice. He seemed to be trying to explain something to me, as if he was saying, "You're not going to die here. Not like this." At least that's what my mind translated in the state I was in. I tried to lift myself up a little, but the pain made me freeze. He placed one hand on my chest and made a quick gesture with the other, telling me to stay lying down. It wasn't a rude order. It was almost a distress instruction. I obeyed because at that moment, any movement seemed to make everything worse. He then opened a small bag he was carrying and, to my surprise, took out a canteen, a German canteen. He offered me water, in the middle of a war. After finding me thrown to the ground like easy prey, he brought the object to my lips and I drank slowly, swallowing with difficulty, feeling the cold liquid go down my parched throat. When I finished, a tremor ran through my body. The pain, the cold, the shock of receiving help from someone who should have been my enemy, it all mixed together. I didn't know what to think. War creates monsters on both sides. But at that moment, all I saw was a man who didn't want to let another die like that. But the test wasn't over yet. Quite the opposite. At any moment, other soldiers could appear. A patrol, another tank, a sniper. If anyone saw us there, I would die. And so would he. The decision he made didn't just save my life, it put his own in direct danger. Suddenly, we heard something in the trees. A dry sound, like footsteps cutting leaves and branches. He reacted instantly. He grabbed his gun, not to point it at me. He looked in the direction of the sound, his body tense, ready to face whoever it was. I cowered as best I could, my heart racing. The noise grew louder, closer, tree trunks cracking, leaves being swept away. He leaned his back against the trunk beside me and raised his weapon. That was the clearest proof that he had already made his decision. He was protecting me from other soldiers who could kill me, and kill him for helping me. The sound faded, and then receded. The pilot waited a few seconds before lowering his weapon. Silence returned, but the air was heavy, thick with tension. He knew this couldn't last much longer. At any second, someone could appear and destroy everything. That's when the situation reached its peak, putting both the physical and mental test to the test. He pulled me a little closer to the tree, carefully, and then gestured toward the tank. I immediately understood what he meant. He needed to decide whether to leave me there or try to take me with him. And I, even without strength, even barely able to breathe, Also needed to decide whether or not to trust that enemy who was risking his own life to keep me alive. He watched me for a long time, as if waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't. My voice was a thread. My body, an anchor. Pain tested me with every breath. My mind struggled between the will to survive and the fear of giving my last breath to someone who, in the end, might change their mind. That was the ultimate test. To believe that, for some reason I didn't understand, that man had chosen not to let me die there. To believe that, even in the midst of the worst war the world had ever seen, a human gesture could still exist. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to accept that my life was now in the hands of a German soldier. When I opened my eyes again, he was already beside me, preparing to help me up. And that's when I realized the real test wasn't just surviving, it was trusting the enemy, trusting that something bigger was at stake. And that moment, that simple moment, changed everything. I thought I had reached my limit. I thought the worst was over. I thought nothing could be harder than trusting an enemy to keep breathing. But I was wrong. The real end point, that moment when death rests on your shoulder and asks if you're ready, was yet to come. It all started when the pilot tried to lift me. He put an arm under mine, aligned my back, steadied my hands, and at that very moment, my body reacted with a violent shock of pain. I felt something inside my chest move wrong. The rib I already suspected was broken seemed to open up again. My vision went white, not black. White, as if a bright light had been turned on inside my head. I lost my breath. I tried to gasp, but nothing came. It was as if my lungs had disappeared. He noticed immediately. He steadied my body back on the ground, carefully supported my head, and spoke something in German. Quickly, worriedly. I didn't understand, but his tone said it all. I was worse off than he had imagined, and worse off than I had realized myself. The sound of war, which had subsided for a few minutes, returned with force. Far away, but coming fast. Artillery, gunfire, shouts. Another troop was approaching, and it didn't seem to be his. The pilot looked in the direction of the sounds, then at me. His eyes said it all. We don't have any more time. He was torn. I could see it clearly. If he stayed with me, he risked being caught. If he left me, I would die. He ran his hands over his face, rubbing his forehead forcefully, as if trying to ease the weight of an impossible decision. I, for my part, began to feel something strange. It wasn't pain. It was cold. A cold that didn't come from the air. It came from within. The kind of cold that rises slowly, takes over the chest, reaches the neck. A cold that doesn't warn. A cold that announces only one thing. I was erasing. I tried to speak, but my tongue wouldn't respond. I tried to reach out, but my hand went limp. Limp. I tried to take a deep breath, but only half the air came in. That's when I understood. My body was giving up. The war, the wound, the blood loss, the accumulated pain, everything had pushed me to the limit. And now I was crossing it. The pilot noticed. He quickly knelt down, cupped my face in his hands, and spoke loudly, as if trying to pull me back to consciousness with the force of his voice. But I heard everything from a distance, muffled, as if I were underwater. The sound of artillery was getting closer. The shots were clearer, and mixed with that, I heard another terrible sound. Tank engines. Several, not one, several. The ground began to vibrate again. It was another formation, advancing, and from the noise, it was large. The pilot looked at me and then at his tank. He knew he couldn't lift me anymore or drag me, but he also knew that leaving me there was condemning me. He was cornered between two choices that would destroy any soldier from the inside. Save himself or try to save someone who, in the end, was officially his enemy. And it was at that point that my mind began to completely shut down. My vision blurred. My body felt heavy. I tried to hold on to consciousness, like someone holding onto a slippery thread, but it was slipping away. Quickly, I felt my heartbeat slowing. It wasn't my imagination. I could feel it. Each interval between heartbeats seemed longer than it should have been. The pilot placed his hand on my chest, as if trying to gauge my heart rate. His face changed. He realized I was going. I don't know if he knew the word in English, but his look was universal. He's dying. At that moment, the engines drew even closer. The ground shook violently. The sound of the armored vehicles was so loud it swallowed everything. The pilot stood up quickly, grabbed his weapon, looked both ways, took several deep breaths, and tightened his grip on the gun's handle. He seemed ready to fight, not for himself, but to buy me a few seconds. And then, it happened. The first tank emerged from behind the smokescreen. It belonged to his army. The symbol painted on the side gave it away. They were coming fast, aggressively, like people, expecting to find hidden enemies. If they found me there, I would be executed without a doubt. And him? He would be arrested, perhaps killed for treason. The pilot looked at me one last time, and it was in that second that I felt my body give out. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The light in my eyes dimmed at the edge. I thought I had died right there. But before I passed out, I saw something. A quick gesture. The pilot ran to me, leaned my body, dragged me a few inches back into the shadow of the fallen tree. Then he placed his own body between me and the approaching tanks. He was hiding me, hiding a wounded enemy soldier from his own army. I heard voices shouting, harsh, tense Germanic words I didn't understand. He answered quickly, firmly, as if giving a report. He pointed in another direction, the opposite direction from where I was. It was a lie. He was diverting the troops away from me. It was obvious. The tanks passed close, very close. The ground shook, smoke, billowed violently. Someone asked something else. He answered. The troops advanced, and when the noise finally began to fade away, my world completely went dark. Not from fear, not from pain, but from the absolute certainty that this was the end for me. I died a little that day, or I thought I did, and little did she know that, upon waking up, everything would become even more improbable. When consciousness returned, I didn't feel relief, I felt fear, because, for a few seconds, I didn't know where I was, who was nearby, or even if I was still alive. The light came faintly through my half-open eyes, filtered by the treetops. The air was cold, damp, heavy, and the silence, that silence was different. It wasn't the silence of war ceasing, but the silence of someone hiding from something far worse. My body felt like it had been left on fire and then thrown onto ice. The pain came in waves, rising and falling, burning and then numbing. My throat was dry, my mouth bitter. My left arm tingled. My leg, I couldn't even feel it anymore. For a second, I thought I had lost all movement. That's when I felt something touch my shoulder. Not a blow, not violence. A quick, firm, warning touch. I opened my eyes and saw him, the pilot, kneeling beside me, covered in soot, breathing heavily, but still there, still alive, and for some reason beyond all understanding, still protecting me. He put a finger to his lips, asking for silence, and only then did I realize why. Footsteps, heavy, slow. Each beat traveled along the ground before reaching my ears. Another tank, maybe more than one. They were close, close enough that any tiny noise would attract attention. My breath caught instinctively. I tried to control my chest, slow my movement, to blend into the forest. The pilot stood leaning against the tree trunk, watching the approach with narrowed eyes, ready to react, but also ready to hide. He held the rifle against his chest, not pointed at me, but at anyone who came through. The woods. The first metallic silhouette emerged from among the trees. Then another, and another. The sound of tracks digging into the damp earth announced that this was no ordinary patrol. It was a search. They were scouring everything, looking for survivors, enemies, remnants of battle. I was exactly the kind of thing they couldn't find. And then came the detail that sent chills down my spine. One of the tanks stopped nearby, very nearby. The engine kept roaring, but the vehicle remained motionless. The driver looked at me. I realized he was prepared to make an extreme decision if necessary. The tank hatch opened. A tall German officer emerged, with a rigid posture and a sharp gaze. He spoke to someone inside, then calmly descended, stepping on the ground as if inspecting familiar terrain. He surveyed the area, analyzing marks, footprints, tracks, and inevitably, he began walking in the exact direction where we were hiding. I felt my heart race. There was no way I could move. There was no way to escape. There was no way for the pilot to disguise my presence. A wounded enemy, breathing with difficulty, leaning against a tree, that would condemn me and condemn him. The pilot realized this faster than I did, and then, suddenly, he did something that caught me completely off guard. He turned to me, crouched down, and placed his helmet on my head. Then he pushed my body under the fallen trunk, covering part of me with leaves, branches, and bits of loose earth. I didn't have the strength to help him. I could only feel the quick, determined touch of his hands trying to hide me, like someone protecting something valuable. When he finished, he turned around, took a deep breath, wiped the dried blood and dirt from his face, and walked over to the officer as if nothing had happened. The officer said something I didn't understand. The pilot responded firmly. He gestured, pointing in another direction as if indicating enemy movement. The officer continued, questioning, growing increasingly suspicious. The pilot remained calm, but I could see in his eyes, even from a distance, that this interrogation could end both of us. I tried to stay still, holding my breath whenever the pain threatened to make me groan. My vision trembled, blurred. The sound of my heart seemed too loud, as if it could be heard from outside. The officer started walking, slowly, heavy steps, straight in my direction. If he took 3 more steps, he would see me. I could feel the ground vibrate beneath his boots. The pilot tensed, his weapon in hand, but pointed downwards, not to attack, but to act if it was the last resort. The tension was so strong that I almost felt the air change between us. And then, the unlikely opportunity arose. Something exploded on the horizon. A loud, dry bang echoed throughout the forest. The officer turned his head immediately. Another sound followed soon after. Gunshots, many, from a distance but enough to attract attention. Someone was shouting orders. A voice on his radio called urgently. War, in some way, intervened. The officer hesitated, glanced one last time at the pilot, and ordered everyone to regroup immediately. He returned to the tank, climbed onto the hatch, and slammed the lid shut. The engines revved, the tracks spun, and gradually the noise began to fade into the forest. When the last sound of metal faded, the pilot rushed back to me. He carefully removed the branches, took the helmet off my head, and checked my breathing by placing his hand on my chest. He seemed so relieved that for a moment he forgot the risk we had both just been in. My body was too weak to understand everything, but one thing was clear. I had just survived by a hair's breadth, a detail that should never have happened. The distant explosion, the shots that drew attention, the need for their troops to retreat. That wasn't luck. In the midst of war, there was no such thing as luck. That was an improbable, brutal, unexpected chance that fell upon us like a final thread holding my life together. The pilot took a deep breath, hands on his knees, trying to compose himself. Then he looked at me in a way I'll never forget. It wasn't pity. It wasn't duty. It was something rare in that devastated field. It was his silent decision that he wouldn't abandon me. And at that moment, even without being able to move a muscle, I knew that my time was not yet over. The improbable had just happened, and it wasn't the last surprise of the day. When the pilot returned to me after losing the patrol, I realized he was different. His gaze no longer held that initial doubt, that uncertainty about what to do with me. Now there was a firmness, almost an urgency. He knew that time was running out for both of us. The forest was becoming quieter, which, ironically, meant more danger. In war, silence is never peace. It's just the interval before another storm. He knelt beside me and made a clear gesture. He was going to carry me. I tried to protest, but all that came out of my mouth was a weak whisper. My mind was still trying to process how I, a wounded, unarmed, and practically dead American soldier, was about to be saved by the driver of a German tank. Nothing made sense. Nothing that day followed the logic of war. But there we were, 2 men who, for some reason greater than any flag, were bound to the same fate. He slipped his arm under my back, lifted me up, pressing my body against his chest, and began to drag my weight, forcefully. I felt the direct impact on my broken ribs. The pain was so intense I thought I would faint again. I clenched my teeth, gasped for breath, and let him lift me. He wasn't big, but he had enough strength to support the weight of an injured adult man. It was as if he were carrying something heavier than my body, perhaps guilt, perhaps a debt to his own conscience. When we got close to the tank, I understood his plan. He was going to put me inside. Yes, inside the German tank. The idea hit me like a bucket of ice water. An American, inside a German armored vehicle, crossing a combat zone. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the last thing any trained soldier would do. But at that moment, it was the only real chance of survival, and he knew it. He opened the top hatch and braced my body against the metal edge to catch my breath. I felt the cold metal on my back, the strong smell of burnt oil, grease, and gunpowder. Inside, the tank felt like a narrow, dark, and hot cave. He said something, perhaps to warn me that it would hurt, and it did hurt. When he finally pushed me inside, my injured shoulder slammed against one of the inner walls. A scream escaped my throat. The pain spread a strange heat throughout my arm. He climbed down right behind me and closed the hatch. The sound of the outside world was instantly muffled. Inside, the engine was a living monster, roaring with constant vibrations, like a metallic heart beating without stopping. The cabin was cramped, full of levers, ammunition, flashlights, gears, and the smell of sweat and metal was almost suffocating. He positioned me against the lowest corner, where I would be hidden if someone opened the hatch. Then he adjusted the cloth on my shoulder, checked my pulse, and offered me some more water. I couldn't speak, but my eyes said it all. I didn't understand why he was doing this. Why risk everything for me? Then, he did something I will never forget. He took off the necklace he wore around his neck, a small metal crucifix worn by time and war. He placed it on my chest, against my American uniform, and tightened his grip on my hand. It was there that I understood. Not completely. Perhaps I still don't fully understand it today, but I realized something in that gesture. He wasn't saving me because I was American or because I was the enemy. He was saving me because I was human. And in that devastated field, being human was the most dangerous and courageous act anyone could commit. The tank began to move. The snoring grew louder. The conveyor belts moved forward forcefully. I was thrown from side to side, trying to hold onto the crucifix with the hand that still obeyed me. The pain intensified. The heat suffocated. The smell of burning metal penetrated deep into my nostrils. But there was something I couldn't ignore. He was risking his life to get me out of there. The journey seemed endless. Amidst the noise, I heard voices on the internal radio. "Quick! Urgent German!" He responded naturally, maintaining the charade. At any moment, someone could simply say, "Stop the tank, let's inspect." But that never happened. Perhaps because the war was raging elsewhere. Perhaps because no one imagined that a German soldier would hide an enemy inside his own armored vehicle. Perhaps because the universe decided that that day would be different. After a long time, the tank stopped. He turned off the engine. The silence that followed almost hurt my ears. He approached the hatch, opened it slowly, and looked outside. Then he beckoned me with a gesture. I barely had any strength left, but he lifted me up. The cool air outside hit my face like a punch. It was night. The moon illuminated an isolated area, far from the front lines. Tall trees surrounded the place. There was no one around. He carried me out of the tank and carefully placed me on the ground. We stayed there, just the two of us. Two soldiers who, by an improbable miracle, had survived each other and the war by a hair's breadth of humanity. He then pointed south, indicating the direction I should go. Then he patted his own chest twice, as if to say, "Go, now it's your turn." I tried to say something, but I could only move my lips. He understood anyway. And that's when the final twist happened. He came closer, placed his hand on the side of my head, not like a soldier, like someone watching another fighting against death, and said the only word in English that escaped his lips: "Live, viva." Then he climbed onto the tank, knocked twice on the hatch, and disappeared into the darkness, taking with him the sound of the engine slowly receding away. I stood there, trembling, weak, bleeding, holding his crucifix in my hand. I survived, but I was never the same again. Because on that day I learned that even in the midst of humanity's worst war, a single gesture, a single human being, can change everything. After seeing everything that happened, do you believe that humanity still exists, even in the worst scenarios? If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe to follow other accounts as powerful as this one. And tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. In the end, the war showed one thing. Sometimes, a single gesture of courage and compassion is capable of saving two lives at the same time.